So we have more detective work ahead of us and a mystery. We invite up Fanny Guillaume-Castel to talk about, we saw her last in our last year's meeting online, and she's here to continue to tell us a little bit more about harps. So welcome, Fanny.
I want to just begin by thanking the AMIS for accepting my paper this year. I'm really excited to finally meet you all in person. And I'm also excited to thank the Group Committee for allowing me to be here, actually, with all of you. So thank you, everyone. All right. So if you ask anybody, or like when I tell people that I work on the pedal harp, they will usually tell me, oh, Marie Antoinette, okay, she's played the harp, she's Queen of France. Pedal harp. But yeah, it is true that her reign coincided with a flourishing period in the harp history. So following its introduction in France, the harp had been transformed by Parisian musical instrument makers who made a completely new instrument from the German origins, so with new mechanism and new lavish decorations, which quickly linked the harp to rich and luxurious objects, which is what I discussed last year. So not unlike the harp, if you ask French people about Marie Antoinette, they will tell her that she was a figure of luxury who spent crazy amounts of money while the people were kind of starving. And the country was in economic decline, which led to the revolution. So she's not really a well-loved figure in French history. But the association of pedal harp and luxury, and Marie Antoinette as well, has led many collectors to believe that the harp that they owned, because it was rich and beautiful, they would say that it was the harp of Marie Antoinette. So several museums or private collections have claimed that they owned a harp that had been played at some point by the Queen. So I'm not really here to tell you that she didn't play the harp. We have a certain amount of evidence and proof that she did actually enjoy the harp and compose for the harp. But what I, as a historian, am less sure about is which of those proclaimed harps was actually at some point in the Marie Antoinette's hands, and what actually led people to assume such lineage. All right. So I thought it would be good to begin about what about Marie Antoinette's association to the pedal harp. So she was born to the Austrian imperial family, so in her education in Vienna included many music forms, so she was taught singing, she was taught keyboard, as we can see here on this 1770 portrait, but she was also taught the harp. So when she arrived in Versailles, she continued to play the harp. She would usually play between an hour and a half and 2 hours every day, which is a practice that her mother disdained because she thought it was unfit for a queen. But when she arrived in Versailles, people were already playing the harp. So the daughters of Louis XV, who were nicknamed Mesdames, had been playing the harp since at least 1759, so 10 years after its introduction in France. For that, we have proof in the royal family papers. So, for example, we have purchases from the Menu Plaisir, which is the sort of leisure administration of the court, from several makers. We have bills for reparation over string purchases. And we also have this beautiful portrait of Madame Victoire, who was painted actually playing a harp. And in Versailles, the passion of the Queen for the harp and of the rest of the royal family actually set a trend for the instrument amongst the members of the court and other members of the family. So, for example, the Comtesse d'Artois, Princesse de Lamballe, or Madame Elisabeth all started playing the instrument, taking in the example of the Queen and of Mesdames. And at the time, so just like the harp, the Queen's taste wasn't generally really closely followed by the rest of the court and the rest of the people who could afford her lavish tastes, of course. And her wishes were executed by furniture makers who worked for her. So, for example, she had a passion for jewelry, and she wanted that to be included in her furniture and objects that she liked to surround herself with. So, for example, including the materials or techniques of jewelry on furniture. So a lot of her furniture has like motifs of pearls, for example. She was also influenced by the return of nature that came with the Enlightenment, and particularly with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's work. So we have that in the motifs of her furniture. We see nature, flowers, and plants integrated. And around the mid-1780s, there was also the antiquity revival in Europe that followed the Pompeii rediscovery. So all of those elements can be found in designs and motifs of the furniture that had at some point belonged to the Queen. Like those, the two are presented here. During her time as the Dauphine, so before she became an actual queen, she quickly appointed 2 harp makers to her service. So first Naderman and then Cousineau. I'm going to begin with Jean-Henri Naderman because chronologically he was the first to be appointed member by Marie Antoinette. Jean-Henri Naderman had settled in Paris in the early 1760s, following an immigration wave of talented craftsmen from the German region who were attracted by the booming Parisian luxury market, which was the topic of my paper last year. He actually became a master of the Guild of Musical Instrument Makers in 1766, while he was still settled in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, which is an area of Paris that was bustling with woodworkers and furniture makers at the time. The Queen appointed him as luthier to her service in 1772, which is the first image we have on top here. And he remained in service until 1792, so 20 years of service, with a yearly bonus of 125 livres at the end of her reign. The name of the Dauphine and then the name of the Queen was actually included in all of his harps label, which we can see here at the bottom. So this is a harp from 1773, which is held at the Maison Georges Sand in France. And on the label, we see Naderman, maître luthier ordinaire de Madame la Dauphine. So the Dauphine was the title that she got when she arrived at Versailles and just before she was crowned queen in 1775. But even though we have this information about linking Naderman to Marie Antoinette, we don't have any actual bills from Marie Antoinette to Naderman. But we do know, so this image I put on the bottom right, that in 1776 she owed him 150 livres, which could actually represent one or more harps even. So for example, Madame Victoire, which I pictured earlier, she purchased a harp from Naderman, which costed 800 livres, which at the time, it was considered to be extravagant by the harp teacher to Madame. So it is possible to assume that 1,050 livres were either one big, really decorated harp or even several harps. The other harp maker that she appointed was Georges Cousineau, who had moved to Paris in 1750 when he began an apprenticeship with a Parisian musical instrument maker. Just 5 days after the death of Louis XV in 1774, and just a year before Louis XVI's coronation, Cousineau had petitioned to be appointed as harp maker to the Queen, which is the image I put first here. And we can see that I cut the image, but we can see on the right, it just says good, so it means that it was actually accepted. Just like Naderman, Cousineau did display his affiliation to the Queen on the harps, but not on labels this time. He'd rather show it on the outside of the instrument because the labels were on the inside, of course. So I've put two examples here because usually it was written on a ribbon, just like the one in the middle, which is from the Mergellinck Museum in Belgium, which is, you can't really see it, but it's Cousineau, luthier de la Reine. And it's the same in medallions on this harp from the Musée de la Musique, which you can see on the right. So the affiliation of these two makers with the Queen was actually an important part of their recognition and their business on the Paris musical instrument market. But however, this has led many people to believe that their instruments that was made either by Naderman or by Cousineau to actually have belonged at some point to the Queen. But why would people search the exact instrument of Marie Antoinette, which is, as I said, one of the most controversial figures in French history, and how did it get to that conclusion? In the 18th century, saw the increase of celebrity culture, which was in part due to the high volume of prints. So, for example, images and texts could now be shared with more people than ever, which was very beneficial to get the figures of the royal family known around the country. So I've put here a couple of prints of Marie Antoinette, which were distributed around France to get the Queen known from the people. Because upon her arrival at Versailles, Marie Antoinette was quite popular. Everyone was happy to know that they were going to have a queen coming from the Austrian imperial family, which was well respected. But quickly at court, she became bored of the strict etiquette, so she had begun to gain taste for privacy. So for example, she attended events like theaters and operas anonymously, which meant she wore a mask and would not disclose that she was at the location. And for example, she spent as well more time in the Petit Trianon, which is part of the palaces of Versailles, and a place that where only a selected few could visit her. This actually enticed the curiosity of the rest of the court and creating a need for them to get closer to the Queen because of this privacy. But it also led people to grow more suspicious of her, and people became more obsessed with her and suspicious with what was going on in her so private life. In a series of scandals in the mid-1780s, and the French Revolution had completed her bad reputation of secrecy and everything that everybody could imagine was going on behind those closed doors. And until the 1850s, the figure of Marie Antoinette was actually still a hated one amongst French politics, because the politics flew between the Republic and Empire, both systems trying to distance themselves from the old regime and the Bourbon royal family. And it took until the Empress Eugénie, who was the wife of Napoleon III, crowned emperor in 1853, because she was among those who had an important respect for Marie Antoinette, and so she organized an exhibition at the Petit Trianon, so the Palace of Marie Antoinette, with objects that had belonged to her in 1867, which paid homage to the Queen. It was also helping to launch a new fashion for 18th century in France. By the end of the 19th century, there was a number of new historians and art historians from the Legitimist movement, which was a political movement that came in the reaction to the French Republic and which the return to a kingdom led by the Bourbon family. So these historians took at heart to look back at important figures in royal history, and importantly Marie Antoinette, whose story had not yet been properly studied, and they presented her as kind of a martyr, of whom it became crucial to find the relics. So that could be any items that she had owned, or even parts of her own body, like her hair, for example. This fascination, although for today's standards and celebrities a bit tamed, it remains for celebrities of century past, even in the 21st century. So as recently as last April, a lantern that I've pictured here said to have belonged to Marie Antoinette was sold at an auction in France, and items allegedly of Marie Antoinette have graced auction houses regularly, with here a few examples, all dated from between 2016 and 2022. So we have the lantern, a mirror, a shoe, and some miscellaneous objects. I didn't include it, but there was also, I think I found 3 or 4 auctions of strands of her hair, usually in a frame. Oops, sorry. Oh, there we go. So relics of celebrities are also prominent in music history, as most of you know. An instrument that once belonged to any famous musician or composers can easily make the headlines, even of generic public newspapers, as I've shown here. And it also sometimes shed light on research organological works. Musical memorabilia was also a common practice in the 19th century. So I take, for example, the collections at the Library Museum of the Paris Opera, which I worked at, and are full of relics from 19th century musicians and musical celebrities. So for example, they have strands from Berlioz's hair, they have cast of dancer Emma Livry's leg, or even they have Beethoven's pistol. Like items that don't have really much organological value, but are memorabilia from musicians or music celebrities. These objects are actually considered in their materiality because we see this object as, oh, someone / Mozart / Beethoven touched this object in kind of a relic and religious-like fascination. Unfortunately, in many cases, these items can reach very high prices because of their alleged history, and they can be purchased by collectors with little to no musical interest who just want to have a piece of celebrity. On the other hand, some, like the Cope collection in England, have made a specialty of studying, playing, and exhibiting celebrity instruments in more of a study and organology fashion. With all this information about celebrity and the cult of Marie Antoinette, I want to look at the harps that have been said of Marie Antoinette and how people have led to link them to the Queen. The fascination for the Queen and the search for her materiality has led many to claim to have found the harp of Marie Antoinette. But unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, we have very few archival sources that prove of her harp purchases, so it's difficult to assume which harp did she actually own. For other items that had belonged to her, curators and historians have a number of data on hand that help them trace back the item to their original owner. In many cases of royal commission, for example, the items bore the figure of the king or queen. So for Marie Antoinette, that was an M and an A intertwined, which I've shown here on the left. Historians can also trace items on the registries from the garde-meuble, which took care of all the furniture of the royal palaces and other royal institutions, that all listed the furniture and objects that were housed in the palaces of the royal family. I have found traces of harps in these inventories, but they're usually only listed as harp. so that doesn't help us. It is assumed that as a queen, as I've mentioned, her harp must have been decorated with precious materials and motifs that would help us to determine a link. But some of the motifs that were used for her items can be characterized. So, for example, the featuring of an eagle for her Austrian birth, or a crown for her status of queen. Now let's get in details into those famous harps. All right, so I'm going to begin, where else to begin, but in her own house, the Château de Versailles. The chateau holds today 2 pedal harps from the 18th century. One is from the 1790s and it is from an unknown maker. The other one is from Jean-Henri Naderman, which I talked about earlier. This harp was purchased in 1968 and was reputed upon its purchase to have belonged to Marie Antoinette. So we can see, I've shown here in the middle, so the strass on the pins and the crochet do remind us of the Queen's attraction for jewelry, materials, and methods of work. So is the insert of mother of pearl, which you can see here on the right, at the base of the instrument. I've seen now today about 200 instruments, and this is the only instance where mother of pearl is included that much in an instrument. So that could explain why we could think this is a royal harp. The label of Harpe Marie Antoinette must have been part of its publicity from the seller, who was an antiques dealer. But in the museum, the curator in place in the 60s had asked for advice from one of his colleagues at the Louvre, and both of them agreed that this could not be Marie Antoinette's harp because, I quote, the decoration is not rich enough or sufficient to be linked to the Queen, which actually leaves us dreaming of a super ornate pedal harp from Marie Antoinette, because this one is already quite heavily decorated. The harp in Versailles has a sort of cousin at the Musée de Musique in Paris that bears very similar decoration. So we find again the strass on the pins and the crochet, and like the previous one, it does feature some bird sculptures and is gilded and bronze gilded around the instrument. This harp was gifted into the museum in 1873, and when the curators in post there proclaimed it was one of 2 harps that were built by Jean-Henri Naderman for Marie Antoinette in 1780. However, this claim is countered when we actually study the inside of the instruments, because I found a label on the inside that does say that it is dated from 1776. So not exact dates that the curator said, but it's still a very plausible date for a provenance of Marie Antoinette. But the Cousineau harps have also been claimed of Marie Antoinette. I've only shown you 2 Naderman so far, but this is an example from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. This harp was gifted in 1868, as having belonged to Marie Antoinette. But more recently, in Anthony Bain's catalogue of the collection, he did say that there was no evidence of that. The harp, like the 2 previous ones, does bear decoration that could lead us to think that it could have belonged to Marie Antoinette or someone in the royal family. At the base are sculpted 2 cocks, the symbol of France, and the symbols that can also be found on the canopy of Marie Antoinette's bed, which is what I've shown here on the right. Today, only one harp is still entitled Harp of Marie Antoinette by its museum, and a museum who refuses to hear any other arguments than that. It's the Naderman harp at the Musée de Vendôme in central France. It is true that this one has, I think, the most convincing decoration to link it to Marie Antoinette. So on the column I've shown here in the center, there is a sculpture that looks like an empty coat of arms, which is topped with an imperial crown, which would link to the Austrian Empire. The coat of arms was painted in blue, which is the royal French color, but there are missing attributes that we have traces of, and those could have been actually fleurs de lys, a symbol of the French regime that were destroyed during the Revolution. This harp was given to the museum in 1904 by Mademoiselle de Trémaux, who claimed that this harp had been in her family and was given to her ancestor by Madame Elisabeth, so the sister of Louis XVI. And in the portrait of Madame Elisabeth, which we see here on the right, we can see that she plays a harp that looks very similar to the one now held in the Musée de Vendôme. It remains possible that Marie Antoinette could have offered this harp to her sister-in-law, as it appeared to be a common practice at court. So, for example, Madame Elisabeth, that you can see here, she gave harps to her friends and lady-in-waiting, like the Marquise de Montbel, who received at least 2 harps from Madame Elisabeth. Once again, the lack of description in the archives of the harps of the Queen do make it difficult to say exactly if this one had belonged to her. There is actually one final harp that I'd like to discuss, and it's quite different than the previous one in that it was not built by neither Naderman nor Cousineau. So this harp is held at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, and it was built by Jean Louvet in 1774, the year Louis XV passed away. Like the Vendôme one, we can see that it does bear a coat of arms, this time with the fleur de lis, gilded. This one is topped as well with the figure of the crowned eagle, which I mentioned earlier as a symbol for the Austrian Empire, so that could symbolize the link between France and Austria. That was Marie Antoinette. This harp was given by descended from the La Tour d'Auvergne family, who claimed that they owned it from Marie Antoinette, who had gifted it to them before the Revolution. But again, we don't have any more further evidence than to trust the family who gifted it to the museum. When I begin working on this paper and gathering information about this, I hope to present you more convincing candidates for the title of Better Harps of Marie Antoinette. But this case study has shown me that really a combination of sources is necessary to perfectly define the provenance of an object, which is not always possible, as is the case here. Sure, if I was only interested in the manufacturing or the materiality of the harp or the decoration, just the harps would have been good enough sources. But if I want to look a bit further than that, I need to complement that with iconography or archives of different sorts. As we've seen, provenance research in musical instruments gained tremendous momentum in the past couple of years, particularly for eras like the Second World War or the colonization periods. It appears that such research could also be useful to uncover a more ancient history, so as to get as close as possible to the actual truth. So the next one. Thank you very much.
So, questions for Fanny? Let it fly.
Let it fly.
Well, you can always talk to her later. Last chance.
Thank you very much for a great paper. So I'm still formulating this question, so I apologize in advance if it's incomprehensible. 10 years ago, I was working on a project where I was looking at the kind of revival of harpsichords in the late 19th century, and it was really striking, especially at the exhibitions that were held in the 1880s and 1890s in London and Paris and other places in Europe, that so many instruments were being billed as being attached to often aristocrats. There's a lot of things that were ascribed to Queen Elizabeth in England. And so I'm just wondering, to what extent do you think that this kind of mythologizing, this attribution, is also part of an impulse to kind of associate an instrument with an era, with an atmosphere, and that someone like Marie Antoinette, in addition to being a famous person, also becomes kind of like a symbol of, the whole ancien regime or something. I'm just wondering, to what extent it kind of goes beyond just the individual and becomes kind of like a shorthand for a larger feeling of history.
Thank you for your question. It's a very interesting one, and we had a similar thing in the pedal harps history in the 19th century. For example, the Erard house, which built pianos and harps, started building in 1873 for the Universal Exhibition a pedal harp that they said was in the Louis XVI style, which was kind of those harps on steroids, just like super big with big gilding everywhere. And it still even continues today. So the Salvi company, which was one of the last few harp making companies in the world, outed, I think 2-3 years ago, a Marie Antoinette harp, which was similar, so with big modern dimensions, but with those big decorations as well. So it proves that even still today, Marie Antoinette is attached to that period of history and that type of harps with the big scrolls on the hand and the gilding and the decoration. So it's still very much the case today, yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. You mentioned that Marie Antoinette also composed, so this sounded exciting. If you could tell something about this, and also the repertoire she played, or special types of pieces she preferred, or any way in this kind of court harp culture, what kind of repertoire, mostly women, I understand, played.
Yeah, of course. Well, as I said, her passion for the harp coincided with a new era for the pedal harp. So at the time, the harp was more played in the salons, like the picture I showed in the beginning, which is just in her chambers with like her closed court. So they would usually play like just simple pieces, sonatas for the pedal harp. So far as her composition, we know of, I think, 2 pieces that is the same. We think it might have been her, because we know she took composition classes from Gluck, for example. But she wrote 2 pieces which are kind of a bit boring 18th century harp and singing with very classical theme of, I think it's a shepherd and a shepherdess, something like that, yeah.
Any further questions? All right, well, thanks
All
very
right.
much, Fanny.
Thank you very much. Thank you.